Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Looking at Chapter 1, Key Issue 4, and the big question here is why are some actions not sustainable? Why are resources being depleted? We need to know what a resource is, and you guys know this already, but a substance that is in the environment that is either useful to people in some kind of economic or technical way, and that we have access to actually get to. All right, so we think of things like fossil fuels, right? Oil, coal, natural gas. But we have started to change some of that as well. And we talk about the idea of sustainability. We know that those fossil fuels aren't really sustainable over time. And so we need to use the Earth's resources in a way that will help us have an availability for those resources in the future. And when we talk about renewable energy, we start to look for things like hydroelectric power or geothermal power or fusion or wind or solar. Those are all things that have an unlimited supply. We can always use those, and we'll be able to use them in the future as well. And then we get to the idea of those non-renewable energies that we talked about, basically fossil fuels, right? Oil, coal, natural gas. Those are things that form. It takes hundreds of years, thousands of years in some cases to form those, and so we don't have a way to renew those energies as easily. How are we impacting the environment? A lot, right? When we talk about our environment, one of the ways is through air pollution. We look at, on a global scale, we talk about this idea of global warming. And yes, it is proof that the world has started to warm, whether or not it's all human-based, but the world definitely has started to warm overall. All right. We look at the world's oceans as well have started to warm. We look at it on a regional scale. There are some parts of the world, we see this a lot, especially in Eastern Europe, where we talk about acid precipitation. And that is something that is definitely harmful to the environment and definitely to our drinking water as well. And then on a local scale, we talk about like urban pollution. Some people have respiratory issues because around the city specifically, people, especially in like China, have had to wear masks in some of those cities because of the air pollution being so bad. Mexico City is a good example of a city that has high air pollution. Even Los Angeles, another city that has high air pollution, and it could cause challenges for people that have respiratory issues. We also talk about water pollution. Water pollution is when we look at it, a lot of industries use water. And when they are done using that water, they dump it back into the river or the lake or wherever it's coming from. And that water is unfortunately now polluted. We also look at municipal sewage as the thing that could lead to water pollution. And then obviously agriculture. Agriculture is worldwide probably one of the worst for our environments that we have. Obviously, we need agriculture to survive and for food, but it is definitely difficult on our environment for agriculture. All right. And then finally, talk about land pollution, right? Solid waste disposal, like their picture that we have there. We know that basically more than half of our solid waste ends up going to landfills. Some of it goes into incinerators, which then could lead to air pollution issues. And then obviously recycling has become important. We need to make sure that we're recycling what we can and turning it into reusable products. And then we look at hazardous waste as being a problem as well. We talk about nuclear power and nuclear energy and fission, but there is a waste that comes with that. And so we have to figure out how to handle that hazardous waste as well. So we look at kind of global air temperatures over time, and this is going all the way back to 1880 and right up to about 2010. Doesn't quite get to 2010, I guess, but you can see that we have had our air temperature increase over that given time, right? It's increased almost an entire degree when we look at Celsius here. All right, actually a little bit more possibly, but it is definitely an increase, and we're continuing to see that beyond the year 2000 as well. Here's we look at the global carbon dioxide emissions, and so you can see that this has definitely increased as well from 1850 on to 2000 and beyond. This is an example here of looking at kind of the sulfate deposit levels in some of these kind of industrial areas of the world. And we look at the United States. That area is kind of like considered the Rust Belt between kind of Michigan and Pittsburgh. That's where a lot of the automobile industry had been prior to this. And we also look at that as being a steel industry. And so we see a lot of sulfate deposits in that area. So ground pollution, same thing we see in Europe as well. All right, those are kind of the industrial areas of those two continents. And here's a good example of Mexico City. So you can see Mexico City this is on a higher pollution day versus a non-higher pollution day. And you can see just how bad the air quality could be on a given daily basis with air pollution. And again, this isn't just Mexico City. We see it in other parts of the world too. One place that we see irrigation in agriculture being a major problem is actually the RLC. When we look at the RLC here, it was used heavily for irrigation. You can see over time, this is over a couple decades here, you can see just how small the sea has become. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, that's like modern day versus what it used to be. It used to be a full-size sea. Now, it also it changes it's how full it is based on the seasonal rains and things like that as well. But irrigation has definitely eaten into this sea. And today, a good portion of it is gone. There's not a whole lot of the Aral Sea left because most of that area has been using the Aral Sea for watering their crops. And so those are some of the ways we impact our environment, but we can also look at other ways too. And when we start to impact the environment in positive ways, we look at things like renewing resources, right? Things like nuclear energy, which we mentioned. Yes, there is the idea of hazardous waste that comes with it, but we also look at this idea of it doesn't take a whole lot of that waste. It doesn't take a whole lot of our energy to make nuclear energy. And so it is not renewable, but it's really close. It doesn't take very much material to make it. And so that's something we might see more of in the future. We also talk about the idea of biomass. So wood and crops and any kind of waste that we can get from agriculture can be used to make energy. So your best example of that, especially in our area, is ethanol, right? Corn in our area is used to make ethanol, which is a fuel. We see Brazil is really big in ethanol as well. In fact, Brazil, as of right now, is like the only country in the world that could continue to run if we ran out of gasoline today, because their entire country runs on ethanol. And the ethanol there is used different. It uses different crops. It doesn't use corn for everything. It uses the crop waste. We also talk about hydroelectric and wind and geothermal and solar, all really viable, renewable resources that we will see more of in the coming days and coming years for sure. We also look at recycling. Recycling as a way for us to impact our environment positively, right? Recycling goods, making sure that you take your plastic and your containers and make them into something new. And that's the way that we can recycle the best, obviously. Use those things we already have rather than throwing them in landfills. So what other ways are we impacting our environment? We talk about sustainable development. And so we talk about this idea of conservation and preservation. And so when we talk about conservation, what ways are we able to sustainably use and manage our land and our resources? And when we talk about preservation, we're getting more into the idea of how can we maintain what we already have in the current condition that it's at, because we need to make sure that future generations have access to this energy and these different energy sources as well. And obviously our earth too. And so we also get into this idea of biodiversity. Scientists believe that it's obviously important for us to preserve the life that is already on Earth. We don't want to lose any more animals or every other kind of species, and we don't want to see more endangered and extinct animals. And so that's a big idea, is preserving what we currently have, whether it's energy, whether it's on Earth itself, or whether it's animals or our environment. We need to make sure that we use this system. We talk about the 3 pillars of sustainability here. We look at it as social, environmental, and economic. And we have to make sure that we're doing those 3 things in the best interest of ourselves, our futures, and obviously our planet too. We also get into a little bit of cultural ecology. And when we talk about cultural ecology, one big aspect of that is what we call environmental determinism. And so when we look at ecology, we're talking about our environment and how we interact with it, obviously. But if we go all the way back to the 19th century, von Humboldt and Ritter came up with this idea that our physical environment could cause social development. All right, so if you have a more if your social environment or physical environment, is better, it may work for better social development for people as well. And so geographers has kind of expanded on this idea over time, and they started to study the influences of natural environment on the people of that area. And so climate was a major determinant when we look at civilization. Most of our original ancient civilizations started in kind of the same latitude, same climate, and access to water. And so it is very possible that environmental determinism is what started. But we then get to this idea of possibilism. And possibilism is what we look at for today. And that is that the physical environment may limit our actions as humans, but we have the ability to change those things. We have the ability to adjust our environment to the best situations that we have. All right. And so when we talk about an example of possibilism at work, there are places around the world that humans should not be able to survive, but yet we have adapted, right? We live in the middle of the desert. We farm in the middle of the desert. right? We live in very, very cold climates, like here in Minnesota sometimes, and we're able to adapt to those things. Here's a good example they talk about in your book of sustainable ecosystems and this idea of kind of possibilism. This is the Netherlands here, and so if you take a look at the Netherlands, this is kind of what they've created for their farming and their irrigation here, and so this is a sustainable ecosystem, what they have established and what they've created. We can also look at other parts like unsustainable ecosystems. In Cape Town, they also use in your book here this kind of case study that the lake in that area of Cape Town, South Africa, obviously it seasonally changes with the amount of rainfall, but you can see they've used so much of that due to access for water for the city and also for irrigation purposes for crops that the lake has started to dry up throughout most of it, similar to the Aral Sea. One last thing they get into in this chapter here at the very end, it doesn't really go with the rest of it, but that's this idea of time zones. And so we wanted to make sure that you had this in there as well. There are 24 time zones across the entire globe. It's about 15 degrees of longitude between each of the time zones here. And it was actually originally created by the railroad system in the 1880s. And the base of all time zones is Greenwich Mean Time in the United Kingdom. And then from there, it continues on throughout the day. The U.S. has 4 time zones. It also has Alaska, and it also has Hawaii, who have their own time zones as well. And our international dateline is about 180 degrees longitude. All right, so you need to know a little bit about time zones, and maybe this map is actually the most helpful. You can see Greenwich Mean Time there, or right down the meridian. And then through the United Kingdom, and then we can see the international dateline, which kind of weaves its way around Russia and the United States as it works its way down the Pacific Ocean right there. And so basically on the western side of the international dateline, it is Monday, and on the western side of the international dateline, eastern side of the international dateline, it would be Sunday still. All right, and so that's where the day kind of flips over at that point. But you can see our 4 time zones. And again, like we said, we have Hawaii and Alaska in there with their own time zones as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, now that we've gone through both Chapter 1, Key Issue 3, and Key Issue 4, make sure that you go back and write a summary, summarize your information here that we've kind of talked about, just so you can kind of keep track of what we've talked about and what we've learned, and prepare yourself for our test. Good luck. We'll see you again soon.